Hey, what's up, everybody? Puppy Brozo here. It's been a while, and today I'm gonna change it up on you guys a little bit and do a video that's mostly audio for today. Um, I'm just very tired, and my living quarters is kind of a wreck, and I've got a lot of work to do. But I did want to get back to this topic since I plan to do a follow-up video um, on narcissism for some time, but I've been so busy with a lot of things outside of the internet that I haven't had time to really sit down and make a video. So, um, can narcissists change? Let's talk about that for a second. Um, I've seen this question come up in a lot of different forums that I'm a member of for people who have survived narcissistic personality disorder. Um, and when I say survived, I mean survived being with someone who had it, being a victim of the abuse of a narcissistic individual. Um, and I see a lot of people joining the forums lately who are still with their narcissists and want to try to basically mend or salvage the relationship because they genuinely love their narcissist and they don't want that person to leave. Um, the same question that keeps coming up, whether these people are diagnosed or feel like that they should be diagnosed, is that basically, is there any hope for them and the people that love them? Is there anything that we can do if we see early warning signs or actual diagnostic criteria besides end the relationship? And as simple as they might seem on the surface, questions like these resonate with some of the deepest concerns in psychology. Can we change our personalities? And more to the point, can people who meet criteria for personality disorders open themselves up to new and better experiences in relationships and in the world in general? Um, I mean, I would say yes, that I do believe it's possible for people to change, even if they've been diagnosed with something as deeply entrenched as a personality disorder. Um, Trait labels like narcissist, or the less stigmatizing ones like extrovert and introvert, merely basically provide a shorthand description. They're basically a stand-in for quote unquote this person has scored high on a trait measure of narcissism or extroversion or introversion. And they can never hope to capture the whole person. Bear in mind that people, even the person who introduced the latter concepts, firmly believe that we all possess both introvert and extrovert qualities. Regardless of how much we tend to one side or the other. But nevertheless, when they become diagnostic labels like narcissist or narcissistic personality disorder, these descriptions imply something that goes much further than a tendency or just a style. They suggest what's known as permanence, and a set of basically stable enduring features. um, Again, it's not one or two things about these people that qualify them as a narcissist. It's in layman's terms basically a pattern of habits, and you can pretty much break down these patterns over time of knowing the person. You'll know when they're going to take an issue with something. You'll know when they're going to start gaslighting. You'll know what causes them to want to gaslight and things like that. I guess the patterns become somewhat recognizable to a degree. I personally believe rather than simply being who we are, our personalities are also patterns of interaction. Um, and that means, like, personally, whether disordered or not, it has as much to do with how and with who we interact as it does with our genes and our wired and temperament. So, that being said, what pattern does the narcissist actually follow, right? Um, Now, a lot of people have suggested that NPD emerges from an environment in which vulnerability comes to feel dangerous, uh, representing at worst either a grave defect or at best a stubborn barrier to becoming a worthwhile human being. And that's really simplifying a great deal of research and theory, but it's a workable summary. Um, hence the correlation between NPD and insecure attachment styles, in which fears of depending on anyone at all endanger constant attempts to control the relationship or avoid intimacy together. Um, if you devote yourself to directing interactions or holding people at arm's length, it's a lot harder to become vulnerable. And needless to say, the safety is largely an illusion. Um, people with NPD have pretty much learned to ignore, suppress, deny, project, and pretty much disavow their vulnerabilities, or at least try to, in their attempts to try to shape and reshape who they are within their interactions with people. Um, Change, basically allowing the vulnerability back in, means opening up to the very feelings that they've learned to avoid at pretty much all costs. And it's not that people with narcissistic personality disorder or traits of narcissism can't change, it's that it often threatens their sense of personhood to try to change. And their failed relationships often confirm in their minds that narcissism is the safest way to live. So really, a narcissist is not necessarily an inherently evil person. They've learned how to basically treat people like tools because they themselves are afraid to be vulnerable with others. Because at one point or another, it was that very vulnerability that got these people so damaged and so hurt that they basically convince themselves the only way to survive and get through life and get through social interactions is to not see people as human beings and not really hold them in high value, because as a result, since people have basically treated the narcissist so disposable at one or two points in their life that were very detrimental to them, they now see it fit to treat other people the same way. And again, this is a defense tactic. It's basically putting up a wall, and they have this little slider in that wall where they can peek out every now and then, but you never really get too close. Um, at least not close, any closer than the narcissist wants you to be. Um, so to put it another way, narcissists can't really be narcissistic in a vacuum. They need the right audience in order to feel like a star. For example, so they often will cultivate relationships with people who stick around for the show instead of the person. And over time, as their perfect facade starts to slip, their constant fear that people will find them lacking becomes a really horrifying reality. The very people who stuck around for the show lose interest when it ends, which merely convinces the narcissist that they need to hide all their flaws and put on a better show next time. Um, Alternatively, even when they fall for someone who could be more than just an adoring fan, someone who offers the hope of a more authentic and enduring love, most narcissists still live with the paralyzing fear that they will somehow be deemed very unworthy. And their terror is frequently out of awareness and nearly always managed with bravado and blame, but it's profound and palpable. Sadly, their anger at having their mistakes and missteps exposed ultimately alienates their loved ones, and the demise of another relationship basically prompts them to redouble their efforts to avoid vulnerability. So, in short, it pushes them towards more narcissism. Again, this is when I was talking about patterns. This is also how most narcissistic individuals will basically learn to fine tune their narcissism as they go, because I mean, inevitably people will catch on, and you know um, the phrase does stand to be true. It's a small world. I mean, it's a small world after all. So eventually people will catch on to the narcissist, and that's, like I said, when they'll have to start repackaging and revamping their entire approach in general in order to not really face so much exposure or exposure at all. um, so the key then to interacting with someone that you suspect is a narcissist really is to break the circle, to kind of gently thwart their frantic efforts to control and distance, defend, or blame within the relationship by sending the message that you're more than willing to connect with them, but not on these terms. To basically invite them into a version of intimacy where they can be loved and admired, warts and everything, if they pretty much only allow the experience to happen. Um, and that in itself can be really difficult to do, because again, um, that requires the narcissism accepting vulnerability, the narcissist to accept vulnerability, which again is not normally something that they do. That's normally something they fight against, which is exactly why they have that label of narcissist. um, but I've seen firsthand that changing relational patterns often transform even the most inflexible trait into something much softer and gentler. It's not a fixed feature, but a protection that eventually yields to touch and intimacy in all the ways that one would hope. Um, Believe it or not, narcissism is a way of relating. And not everyone can shift into a more flexible form of intimacy, but some can. Um, and there are some steps to help you decide whether or not the person that you're dealing with is capable of seeing themselves, um, as well as you, uh, through basically a less constricting lens than the narcissistic worldview in of itself. Um, and that being said, let's talk about that. Let's talk about some ways that you can help yourself decide whether or not the person that you're in love with is very capable of even addressing the problem, much less fixing it. So let's talk about 7 ways to deal with the narcissist that you love. Okay. The first would be to check for abuse. And, honestly, nothing that I'm about to suggest is probably likely to help you if the person that you love is physically or emotionally abusive. Um, Not all narcissists, even those diagnosed with NPD, resort to that kind of abuse, but some of them do. And if that applies to your situation and you're on the receiving end, your first step should be to explore what makes it hard for you to leave. Um, because if you're facing abuse, it doesn't matter whether it's driven by your partner's narcissism, chronic pain, drug addiction. The problem is the abuse, plain and simple. And the abuser is 100% responsible for their choices, his or hers. And until that changes, you probably won't feel safe enough, and honestly, nor should you, to take the kind of risks that I'm about to recommend. Um, so that being said, if you're in a situation, like I said earlier, where your partner is physically abusing you or emotionally abusing you, these things have a very high capacity to destroy someone over time, especially emotional abuse. Um, I mean, you hear it a lot, scars can heal, this, that, and the third, and that is true, they can. But when it comes to things like physical and emotional abuse, especially toppled with physical abuse, like I said, over time can be severely damaging to an individual. At this point, I would recommend you get out of the situation as best you can. If you have to involve the police, then that's probably something you might need to do. Um, but barring that these types of abuse are not applicable to the situation, or menial emotional abuse, which has a tendency to be turned around, not versus heavy emotional abuse, my second step for you would be to check for denial. Most people recognize denial when they see it. It's pretty much one of the most famous of all the defense mechanisms is denial. The alcoholic who argues, I just enjoy the taste of wine. The terminally ill patient who assures everybody, it's just a cough, or the narcissist who, despite having alienated all her friends and lost their job, proclaims, "I'm fine," are all exhibiting denial. The more denial a narcissist displays, the less hopeful you should pretty much feel about change in general. Um, Now, how bad is the denial? Um, in younger people and adolescents, it predicts some of the most ruthless and demanding forms of narcissism. Adults who happily admit, "I find it easy to manipulate people." Um, Make sure your partner can admit something is wrong, even if it's as simple as saying, "My life isn't where I hoped it would be." Contrary to what you might think, some narcissists do seek therapy. And what kinds of therapy would they seek? Well, I guess the more vulnerable ones, riddled with shame and fear. They freely admit that they have problems instead of burying them beneath mere delusional denial. In fact, they're also more likely to stick with treatment once they start. Um, my next advice would be beware the manipulator. Across most studies of NPD, narcissists who score high on measures of entitlement and exploitation, or EE as researchers call it, have the highest levels of aggression, a very strong impulse to cheat, and even when angered, have a penchant for stealing or sabotaging property at work. Um, and in fact, entitlement and exploitation single-handedly accounts for most of the worst behaviors that a narcissist can display. Manipulative narcissists are also more likely to score higher on measures of psychopathy and Machiavellianism. The former is a cold, callous personality, pretty much linked to criminal behaviors, while the latter, as you can pretty much guess from the name, describes the more cutthroat, do whatever it takes personality. Along with narcissism, these two traits comprise the personality's dark triad. Um, Not all narcissists are pretty much cold and manipulative, but the ones who are pose the greatest threat because they're so practiced at play acting and deceit. You'll have a very, very hard time separating fact from fiction. Um, my next step would be check their willingness to change. I mean, it might seem obvious, but it's really important enough that it really bears mentioning. The easiest way to test a partner's capacity to change is to seek help from a couples therapist or any therapist for that matter. Even people who aren't narcissists can be leery of therapy, so this one shouldn't be considered, um, like a litmus test or anything. If your partner is willing to work with you, though, your odds at improving the relationship have probably jumped by an order of magnitude. Um, my next one would be check your anger. You've always been the paranoid, jealous type. Your partner would say to you, after you openly wonder about the amount of time he's spending with his attractive coworker. Our natural tendency when faced with that kind of shocking indifference to our fear of losing love or needing more closeness and comfort is to protect ourselves. For many people, this means donning battle armor and launching an attack. You're the most selfish person I know. I don't know why I'm with you. Um, and as understandable as the protective measures are, they often cut us off from crucial information. Can our partners hear our sadness and feel moved? If there's any way at all to reach through the detachment, it's by sharing our feelings at a much more vulnerable level. So I would try this. You mean so much to me. I hear you talking to her and I'm scared I'm not enough for you. Or your opinion means the world to me. When I hear you talk to me that way, I feel so small and worthless in your eyes. Most partners, if they can feel anything at all, will melt when they hear comments like this. They just don't convey your pain with greater clarity. They remind your partner why the behavior hurts because it comes from the one person who matters the most. How effective is this kind of communication? uh, Across decades of studies, 90% of couples who learned to share their sadness and their fear beneath the anger healed their broken bond and enjoyed a happy and much closer relationship. Likewise, in multiple recent studies, narcissists who focused on caring and closeness, also known as communal behavior, actually scored lower over time on several measures of narcissism. And those who saw their partners as communal compared to those who didn't even said that they'd be less likely to cheat. Um, my next one would be check your silence. Uh, let's say, for example, you come home from a hard day of work and your boyfriend, grumbling about the weekend plans being up in the air, starts lecturing you about how indecisive you are. Um, you sure take a long time to make decisions, don't you? Condescending remarks like that don't always enrage us, but when our self-esteem is already crumbling, they often shut us down completely. We crawl away or slip into hours of silence. But we have to find a voice again if we want things to get better. Research pretty much suggests that silent withdrawal is just another way of coping with feeling sad or fearful about our connection with people that we love. And your best bet, as with anger, is to go beneath the impulse to shut down and share the upset. You'd say something like, I'm feeling so put down right now, I'm afraid that you've stopped caring about me altogether. Now, why is this so important? um, Though they appear to be universal ways of coping with fears about the people we love, anger and withdrawal also kind of ramp up our partner's insecurities. So the result, our loved ones fall back on their usual way of protecting themselves, like criticism and indifference, instead of hearing our pain. If they're narcissists, that means they resort to their favorite MO, which is narcissism. Um, the next one would be honest with yourself. If you've tried a more loving approach to sharing what hurts in your relationship and the narcissist in your life still won't soften, then you pretty much have truly done everything that you can. This might be the only hope for change. Um, and people that I've seen write on forums say that they've already tried this and it didn't work. They've made a valiant effort, and they might have exhausted all of their supply of empathy from working so hard. My heart goes out to those people in that case. But staying in an unhappy relationship comes at a super steep price, including your self-esteem. You have to get to a point where you can ask yourself honestly, are you staying because your partner is doing their best to change or because it feels too difficult to go? Um, even if the people we love want to change, none of us should be expected to endure the same hurts over and over again. Everybody's got a breaking point. Um, and narcissistic arrogance and hostility kind of elicit our worst behaviors. They get beneath our skin. They work away like 1,000 needles. The natural response is to do one of two things: you either pull away or lash back. But if you do your best to share the pain openly and letting your loved ones see your softer feelings, you're giving them their best and only shot at hearing you. And if they can't understand your pain, then perhaps they probably never will. As sad as as difficult as it might be, you need to take control of yourself by leaving. Because regardless of which habit steals their attention away from genuine love and intimacy, if the ones we love can't risk change, then their problems are pretty much here to stay. And honestly, it's not our obligation to put up with these things. Um, that being said, let's talk about change, um, and how to pretty much overcome the three big obstacles to that change. So let me start by saying our problems often protect us. I don't know if you've seen the movie The Shawshank Redemption. The inmates become so accustomed to the constricted lives that they live behind bars that they have no idea at all what to do once they're released. They have so little experience in making choices, such as how to cross a busy street or find new friends to plan their day, that once they're free, they're completely lost. And as inmates, they never had to face new decisions, or basically the fear that often attends making new decisions. We all build familiar prisons as a protection. The quiet man is drawn to women who call the shots, in part because he too doesn't know how to make his own decisions, and with controlling women, he never has to. The braggart continues to strut about, not just because he's afraid that he'll lose his audience if he isn't always on, but because he has no clue how to be authentic, and his friends probably don't either. And that's using the term friends loosely. The only way any of us can escape our self made prisons is to actively and intentionally practice new behaviors that are sure to make us really uncomfortable to start. If we're unused to expressing opinions, we have to test out, however awkward it is, asserting ourselves. If we hide vulnerability behind posturing, we have to learn to share sadness or fear without that posturing. Um, and if we've lived life way too cautiously, we need to experiment with acting a little more spontaneous. Um, it's really disorienting, and we'll pretty much feel tempted to fall back on old ways because that's our safety net. But we have to stay the course and pretty much stumble through it. And that being said, there will be people around you who might not want you to change. For a woman trapped in relationships with selfish friends or lovers, finding their voice is no easy matter. She can practice assertiveness and skills pretty much ad nauseum. She can search her soul and finally discover what she truly wants, but her friends and loved ones might need her to remain quiet for their own reasons. The self sacrificing woman inevitably nurtures relationships with friends, lovers, or colleagues who don't want to hear their needs. They probably don't even know how to meet them. So when she finally asserts herself, saying she's tired and can't stay up till 2 a.m. helping their latest crisis, they look away in confusion or disappointment, or worse, they get mad. And then she falls silent again and pretty much stays up anyway, despite how miserable she is. This is how we build our own prisons again and again. We read the predictable resistance to our attempts to improve ourselves and as punishment for doing the wrong thing, instead of seeing the backlash for what it truly is, pretty much the growing pain, including the pain sometimes of outgrowing old relationships. Um, some people can accommodate your changes and some can't. With the ones who can't, you might have to move on. If your efforts to improve and sincere and consistent, well, if they are anyway, you'll find that some people are pretty much delighted to meet the new you. Excuse me, I'm stumbling over my words. Your old self will pretty much fight back, though, really hard, and that's pretty much inevitable. Our personality ties us to the people in our lives, and since most of us really don't want to be alone, our old self never gives up without a fight. And writing yourself off as needy, for example, is pretty convenient for friends or loved ones who cringe in the face of any kind of vulnerability. So it becomes a way of keeping them close. Um, the tug of your old self is so powerful that self-loathing people will often go out of their way to avoid supportive friends or partners. They'll even dodge caring spouses in favor of people who consistently put them down. They don't enjoy being hurt, they just don't know how to be close to someone who's nice. So basically they slip back into relationships that confirm their old story of who they are: unworthy, flawed, or broken. We'll nurse the darkest thoughts about ourselves because they protect us from our need for connections. Um, the only way to really push through all this is to prepare for the flight. The old you aggressively seeks out experiences to keep itself alive. Um, you need to recognize, for example, that your queasiness around a cute guy who actually returns your calls isn't bad chemistry. It's your insecure self making you a magnet for unreliable men and women who enjoy playing with your heart and basically dismissing your pain as neediness. You need to resist the urge to flee the caring, self-confident date that you met last night and know that it's your rescuer self, um, preferring to trap you with someone that you need to fix. And you need to admit that your aversion to that woman who doesn't laugh at every single one of your jokes or fawn over your looks is your old arrogant self looking for, the perfect groupie instead of the real partner. Only then you have only when you've learned to resist the pull of the old self can you really explore who you actually are. Then you'll be truly free and pretty much proud of yourself. So, all that being said, earlier I addressed, the reality that there are some dangerous people in the world, and many of them are extremely narcissistic. I also pointed out that narcissism isn't always bad, or bad for us. And I've said this before, and it's led to some mixed reactions, and the general backlash pretty much came down to two questions. Why not just call healthy narcissism self-esteem or healthy self-regard? And doesn't, suggesting a spectrum, including healthy narcissism, confuse already traumatized people into thinking there's hope when there isn't? In my opinion, that's a very big no to both. Healthy self-regard doesn't really capture the widespread cross-cultural phenomenon of healthy, happy people seeing themselves through rose-colored glasses, slightly overestimating their ability until proven otherwise, emphasizing their positive and downplaying their negative qualities, and enjoying grandiose dreams. The list goes on. Self-esteem doesn't really define healthy narcissism either. Some narcissists are high in self-esteem and some are very low. Narcissism of any kind is only weakly to moderately correlated with self-esteem, and even when it's found to be high in narcissists, it's really hard to know what that means in a group of people who exaggerate their gifts. Um, the truth is that the majority of healthy people feel more exceptional than they should based on reality. They self-enhance, and it helps them. Self-enhancement appears to serve no direct purpose other than to help us feel good about ourselves. That's narcissism. It's just that when it's practiced in moderation, not rigid, not rigidly and reflexively as in pathological narcissism, it actually enriches our lives and relationships. Um, and as to objection number two, a spectrum confuses things. I can only say this: what I've seen uh, is that it's categorical thinking. You're either a dangerous pathological narcissist or you're not at all, and that muddies the waters and hopelessly, for really no reason, makes it harder, not easier, for people to leave bad relationships. And all that being said, let's talk about abuse. I touched on abuse a few times here, and I feel like I didn't really clearly elaborate. So, um, let's talk about emotional abuse. And I feel that emotional abuse is a really important and pretty much all too neglected topic very often, unfortunately. And one reason that it's so overlooked is that there's really no laws against name calling, put downs, mind games, though there really should be. Broken legs arguably mend far more easily than broken selves. But the fact that legislation ignores the danger of emotional abuse seems to mirror the way our society in general appears to kind of look the other way. And one question that comes up a lot, I notice, is it possible to not realize that you're being emotionally abused? Sadly and really scary, the fact is, yeah, it is. And one of the most dangerous and insidious forms of emotional abuse is something called gaslighting. Gaslighting comes up a lot when we talk about narcissism and even when we talk about emotional abuse in general. Gaslighting is a very common thing a lot of narcissists will use, especially if they are emotionally abusive. Gaslighting is a term inspired by the stage play Gaslight, in which a husband manipulates his wife into thinking that she's insane by moving things around and literally dimming the gas lights, then telling her she's seeing things or that she's mistaken when she notices the change. Now, why would anyone really do this? Um, Gaslighting, again, like I said, is a very shockingly common trait with extremely psychopathic narcissists, aka malignant narcissists, who thrive on controlling others and feeling powerful. But sometimes, sadly, gaslighting is simply a reenactment, an echo of the perpetrator's own abuse. Post traumatic stress disorder can do terrible things to kids who never process their traumas. Basically, they can grow up to become abusers to ward off, consciously or unconsciously, terrifying fears of becoming victims again. Um, Excuse me. So, a couple months ago, I talked to a friend of mine who didn't even realize that moving objects around and lying about having done so was sadistic and not really simply just a joke. And the habit went back to his childhood. He would say, my mother pulled stuff on me all the time. And he said this very matter of factly. Once when he was 8, after days of lying about having moved a book that he loved, his mother basically admitted, of course, it was where you left it. I was just having fun. Um, he basically grew up to become a man who often played the same pranks on his partners, except unlike his mom, he rarely confessed to it. One day he told me, at least no one can ever pull the wool over my eyes ever again. Um, and he said that as if by controlling the reality of someone else, he never really had to worry that someone might control the way his mom controlled him. And thankfully, we seem to be waking up to the problem of emotional abuse. Um, I often wonder what someone who's spent their entire career studying emotional abuse would name as the 5 most common red flags that they've encountered. Um, and I had, at the same time, wondering, it really had no problem kind of rattling them off. Number one would be putting you down, ridiculing your characteristics, including your strengths. Number two would be basically restricting your behavior, because they're jealous or possessive of you. Intimidating you with what's called the look when they don't like what you're saying or doing. Sometimes, especially in BDSM relationships, where people normally consent to the look as a means of correction. This is where a lot of these things get really heavy, because where in BDSM relationships and the lifestyle that I'm accustomed to, um, the look, like I said, is just a means of correction, and most people get the look and think nothing of it. It's a matter of noticing when the look comes up. But in most vanilla relationships, this kind of thing is an immediate red flag. Um, Number four would be distorting your words, spinning them as negative and self-serving, and basically refusing to listen when you clarify. And blaming you constantly. Rarely, if ever, does a narcissist take responsibility for being hurtful. Um, Emotional abuse hurts really deeply, and you always end up feeling worse about yourself than you did before the relationship started. You should really take emotional abuse pretty seriously. Um, all abuse has a legacy, and if we want to end it, we need to start by educating people about what it is and how it actually works in order for people to overcome it. So let's talk about how to spot a hidden narcissist. The Donald Trumps of the world are pretty much easy enough to spot, but quieter, self-doubting, privately grandiose narcissists are another matter altogether. So are communal narcissists who elevate themselves above the rest of humanity based on their superhuman capacity, in their minds anyway, for selflessness, generosity, and altruism. The only way to spot all narcissists, however subtle or extreme, is to look for what's missing. And we really can't do that if we're looking in the wrong places. And here's a hint, it is not a lack of empathy. Um, I've detailed before why people miss narcissists so frequently, and I've helped people recognize the strategies common to all of them, whether they think they're the smartest, the prettiest, the most misunderstood, or the most giving people in the room. Um, and as you'll see, we have to rethink narcissism to better recognize and cope with the narcissist that's in our lives. Because when we understand what truly drives the narcissist, we empower ourselves. And when we embrace healthy narcissism, enjoying special attention, at least sometimes, with the people we love and trust, we discover a much more important gift, which is the capacity to protect ourselves from extreme narcissists. Um, that's what we all stand to gain from rethinking narcissism.